The air in Onyx Reach tasted like ozone and scorched rubber, the kind of heavy metallic tang that clung to the back of the throat and refused to leave. Overhead, the violet sun of Xylos 4 beat down through the translucent dome of the trade hub, casting long, distorted shadows across the dusty floor of the central plaza. It was a place where things came to be sold when they were no longer needed, and humans were no exception, especially those with synthetic marrow and neural limiters. 10 biological assets stood in a rigid line on the elevated hydraulic platform outside the settlement trade hall. They were Valkyries, Valks in the common street slang, gen-engineered hybrids designed for high-gravity labor and radiation scrubbing. Their skin, a dull, coppery hue typical of the 9 series, glinted under the artificial lights. Quill, a man whose face was a topographical map of deep space scars and bad decisions, paced the edge of the platform with a haptic ledger in one hand. He had been a biological asset broker for 12 years. He had started with ideals about finding good placements for the decommissioned hybrids, but by year 3, those ideals had been recycled into the cold calculus of scrap value. Number 1, Kala, high-density muscle, lungs rated for 60% toxicity. A foreman in a grease-stained jumpsuit stepped forward, checked her ocular implants, and tapped his credit chip. Sold. Number 2, Jax, structural reinforcement in the spine, capable of hauling 200 kilos without a suit. Sold to a mining conglomerate representative with a single nod. One by one, the platform emptied. The assets moved like programmed automatons, their expressions vacant, their purposes defined by the data slates Quill waved at the crowd. Vex sat at the very end of the platform, her knees drawn up to her chest, her back leaning against a vibrating cooling pipe. She had not stood when the others stood. She did not look at the prospective buyers with the pleading hope or the dull resignation of her peers. She simply watched the dust motes dancing in the violet light, and number 10, Quill's voice lost its practiced cadence, becoming thin and raspy. Vex Alpha 9, available for immediate transfer. Minimum bid. What is wrong with that one? A woman in a high-collared executive suit asked, her nose wrinkled as she fanned herself with a digital memo pad. She looks like a stiff breeze would blow her over. Nothing is wrong with her vitals, Quill replied, though he didn't look at the woman. She is small for a 9 series. Her frame didn't take to the final growth acceleration serum. She meets the minimum standards for heavy labor, though. Minimum standards? The executive laughed, a dry, hollow sound. That is a hell of a selling point, Quill. Is she even functional? The word on the street is she has been returned 3 times. A scavenger in the front row spat, leaning over to clear his throat. 3 owners, 3 refund requests. They say she is a glitchhead. Dangerous. Broke her last supervisor's jaw during a routine recalibration. He deserved it, Vex said. The square went silent. It was the first time she had spoken all day. Her voice was not angry or defensive. It was flat, a statement of objective fact delivered with the clinical precision of an AI. Quill closed his eyes, a pained expression crossing his weathered features. Vex, please. Shut it. He did deserve it, she continued, her eyes locking onto the scavenger. He attempted to overwrite my sensory dampeners while I was off clock. A violation of the Asset Autonomy Act, Section 4. I simply applied the necessary force to prevent a system breach. The crowd thinned rapidly after that. People on Xylos 4 wanted tools, not bioassets that could quote the law and break bones. A Valkyrie that thought for itself was a liability, a ticking time bomb in a world held together by fragile atmospheric seals. Show is over, someone muttered. Quill began shutting down his ledger, his assistants already dismantling the overhead shade canopy. He turned to Vex, his shoulders slumping. Every station, Vex, every single outpost, you do this. You have a death wish? Or are you just trying to bankrupt me? I was being accurate, Vex said, returning her gaze to the dust motes. Accuracy is a primary function of the 9 series. The plaza emptied. The vendors closed their shutters. The security drones hummed back to their charging cradles. And Vex sat in the unforgiving violet sun, without water, without shade, without a destination. The hydraulic platform creaked, settling into the dirt like a beast that had finally given up. The sound came from the west gate 40 minutes later. It wasn't the hum of a hover sled or the clatter of a transport. It was the heavy, rhythmic thud of pressurized boots and the erratic wheeze of an old cargo mule, a mechanical beast of burden that looked like it had been salvaged from a pre-war museum. Kalen Voss rounded the corner of the trade hall, leading the mule by a frayed cable. He was covered in the fine purple dust of the outlands, his flight jacket patched with industrial sealant. He stopped in front of the platform, his eyes scanning the empty space before landing on Vex. "Are you the broker?" Kalen asked Quill, who was sitting on a crate, smoking a synthetic leaf. "Sale's over," Quill grunted without looking up. "You are late. You missed the lot. Had 10 assets, sold 9. I am packing it in for the day." "9?" Kalen looked at the girl leaning against the cooling pipe. "What about her?" Quill finally looked up, squinting at Kalen's dusty boots and the tremor in his right hand, a visible rhythmic shaking that Kalen tried to hide by shoving the hand into his pocket. "That is the one nobody wanted. Vex Alpha 9. "Why not?" Quill sighed, the smoke curling around his head. "You want the short version or the honest one?" "I live 5 kilometers from the nearest oxygen well, Quill. I do not have time for versions. Just the truth." "Returned 3 times, Quill said, ticking points off his fingers. "Last owner says she is violent. The one before that says she refuses to follow subroutines. The one before that—" Quill paused, rubbing his temple. "He said she unsettled his drones." "Unsettled his drones?" Kalen frowned. "How do you unsettle an automated security network?" "I looked at them," Vex said from the platform. Kalen turned. She still hadn't moved, but her eyes were open now, tracking him with the flat, predatory attention of an apex predator. There was a strange intelligence there, a sharpness that didn't belong on a liquidation platform. "You looked at the drones and they got unsettled?" Kalen asked. "The sensor logic in the Mark 6 security units is prone to feedback loops when faced with non-standard ocular patterns," she explained. "I merely exploited their lack of heuristic depth." Kalen walked to the edge of the platform and stopped. His shadow fell across her knees, providing a sliver of relief from the sun. "I have an atmospheric siphon 5 miles north," he said. "It is an old lung. The seals are leaking, the pressure plates are warped, and the automated sensors have been dead for a decade. It needs work. I need a technician." "Congratulations," Vex said. That was a statement, not an offer. An offer requires a question. Kalen paused, his right hand twitching violently in his pocket. "Would you be interested in working at my siphon?" "No." Kalen blinked. "No?" "I have had 3 owners," Vex said, standing up for the first time. "Not one of them asked if I was interested. You are the first to ask, and the answer is still no. I am a Valkyrie, not a slave, despite what the union says." Kalen looked back at Quill. "Is she always like this?" "Worse, usually," Quill muttered. "Today she is being charming." Kalen turned back to the girl. "What if I am different?" "Everyone says that," she countered. "What if I mean it?" "Everyone says that too." "There is no right answer, Kalen. There is no answer at all. That is the point." She finally looked at his face. Not through him, but at him. Her eyes drifted down to his pocket. "What is wrong with your hand?" "Nothing," Kalen said, his voice tightening. "It shakes. I can hear the micro vibrations of your metacarpals hitting your thigh. It is a rhythmic disturbance. Cortex static?" Kalen's jaw tightened. "I am aware of the tremor." "Why did you break that foreman's jaw?" he asked, pivoting the conversation. Vex's mouth twitched. It wasn't a smile, but the ghost of one, a flicker of something human beneath the synthetic exterior. "Fair point." Kalen looked at Quill. "How much?" Quill named a number. Kalen's shoulders dropped. His hand shook harder. "That is more than I have in my account. I can give you half that and a crate of refined neon gas." "Half price," Vex said. Both men turned to her. "Tell him half," she repeated to Quill. "You have hauled me through 5 settlements. Every day I sit on this platform, it costs you docking fees, transport credits, and nutrient paste for my upkeep. Half price clears your ledger and gets me off your hands. Full price means you are carting me to the next hub, where I will undoubtedly break someone else's jaw." You are negotiating your own sale price? Quill asked, bewildered. Someone should, Vex said. You are remarkably bad at it. Quill laughed, a short surprise sound. Half. Fine. Get her off my platform before she starts charging me for legal advice. Kaylin counted out the credits with shaking hands. Vex watched the tremor, her head tilted at a slight angle. Steady enough to turn a wrench? She asked. Steady enough for what needs doing, Kaylin replied. When the transaction was complete, Vex stepped off the platform. She didn't have any luggage. She was a biological asset. She owned nothing but the gray jumpsuit on her back and the serial number etched into her neck. Do you have a name? Kaylin asked as they began walking toward the mule. Vex Alpha 9. I meant a name, not a designation. Vex, she said. Kaylin. I didn't ask, she said. I know, Kaylin replied. The road north was a desolate stretch of cracked basalt in obsidian dust. The wind howled through the canyons, carrying the scent of wild sulfur and something burning far in the distance, likely a waste vent from the inner colonies. Kaylin walked beside the mule, his hand tucked firmly into his belt. Vex walked 3 paces behind him. They had been moving for 10 minutes when the sound of a high-speed repulsor engine cut through the wind. A sleek, chrome-plated hoverbike roared past them, kicking up a cloud of violet grit. The rider, a man in a polished Union uniform, pulled up 100 meters ahead and waited. Well, well, the rider grinned as they approached. I heard the scrapper from Siphon 7 finally bought himself a pet. Kaylin didn't stop. He didn't even look up. Hello, Vargo? Vargo nudged his bike closer, the repulsor field humming aggressively. You actually bought that glitch? The one from the platform? He leaned over to peer at Vex. She looks even more pathetic up close. Problem? Kaylin asked, his voice low. No problem, Vargo said, his eyes mocking. Just seems like a downgrade, boss. Your wife leaves you for a sector director, and you replace her with a defective Valk? That is what we call a lateral move in the corporate world. More like a scrapyard special. Vargo's companion laughed from the comms link on the bike. Kaylin didn't answer. His neck went a dark, angry red, his hands tightening on the lead rope of the mule. Vargo laughed, a sharp, cruel sound, and gunned his engine, disappearing into the dust. Vex watched Kaylin's back, the rigid shoulders, the trembling hands. She had had 3 owners. Not one of them had ever been mocked for owning her. This man was absorbing contempt just by walking beside her. She closed the gap between them by half a step, then another. Kaylin didn't look back, but something in his posture eased, barely, like a tension cable given 1 extra inch of slack. They didn't speak for the rest of the walk, but 2 paces felt very different from 3. The siphon smelled of damp stone, ancient grease, and the faint, sweet scent of oxygen. The kind of smell that got into the walls of a building and never truly left. It was a massive, cylindrical tower of iron and concrete that sat in the middle of a shallow valley where the thermal vents bled gas from the moon's core. The lung was a relic of the first terraforming wave, a machine built to breathe when the air was nothing but poison. A giant water wheel, fed by a subterranean stream, turned a central shaft that powered the filtration plates. But the wheel was still now, the channel clogged with silt, the entire place holding its breath in the violet twilight. This is it, Kaylin said, gesturing to the towering structure. Vex looked up. The siphon was a monument to neglected engineering. The roof was sagging, the pressure gauges were cracked, and the external cooling fins were caked in dust. And the house? She asked, pointing to a small shuttered building behind the tower. No, Kaylin said. We live in the siphon. Why? The house is for a different life, Kaylin said, his voice flat. The siphon is for this one. He didn't explain. He walked to the house and Vex noticed the shutters were nailed shut from the outside. Not just closed, but sealed, as if someone had decided the memories inside were too dangerous to let out. You nailed the shutters, she observed. I did. From the outside? That is where I was standing. The interior of the siphon was exactly what Vex expected. Stone floors, massive wooden gears that looked like they belonged in a medieval mill, and a fine layer of dust over everything. Cozy, Vex said, her voice echoing in the vast hollow space. It works, Kaylin said. Mostly. He pointed to a corner across the central millstone, a massive 4-foot slab of granite that acted as the primary friction filter. Your side is over there. I will bring a bedroll. No walls between us? She asked. Kalen pointed to the millstone. 4 feet of solid granite. It is heavier than any wall I could build. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy iron key. Siphon door. It locks from the inside. You hold the key. Vex took it. The metal was warm from his pocket. She looked at the key, then at him. Why give me the key? Because you are the one who knows how to break a jaw, Kalen said. I figured you should be the one in charge of the door. He didn't wait for a thank you. He went to work on the water channel, leaving Vex alone in her corner. The first day passed in a blur of silence. Vex sat on her platform, her back against the cold stone, watching Kalen fight the machine. The lung was dying. Every time the water wheel turned, a sound came out of the gears like a tooth being pulled from a jaw, a high-pitched metallic screech that made Vex's sensitive ears twitch. Kalen adjusted the friction plates 3 times. He cursed them twice. He was trying to produce medical-grade oxygen, but the output gauges showed the purity was barely above 40%. You hungry? Kalen asked at noon. Nothing. I have synthetic protein, dried algae, beans if you want a hot meal. Nothing. Suit yourself. He left a tray near her corner, a bowl of algae mash, a cup of recycled water, and a strip of dried protein laid across the bowl like an afterthought. He went back to the gears, pretending not to notice that she ate only when his back was turned. The second day was the same. Vex sat. Kalen worked. The siphon groaned under the strain of the cracked millstone. Kalen stood over the stone like a doctor, staring at a wound he couldn't stitch. The oxygen coming out of the vents was thin and smelled of sulfur. You sell this? Vex asked suddenly. The 2 words were the most she had said since they arrived. Kalen looked up, startled, his face smeared with grease. When I can. Who buys it? Anyone who can't afford the union's prices. The independent miners, the scavengers, the people the company forgot. Who is the other supplier? Vargo. He runs the Synaptic Union's local hub. Better equipment, purer oxygen, triple the price. He gets the corporate contracts. I get the people who are just trying to stay alive another day. And if your stone breaks completely, then Vargo is the only heir in the valley, and he charges whatever he wants. Vex looked at the granite stone. It turned with a wobble, a hairline fracture widening by a fraction of a millimeter with every rotation. She tilted her head, her hyper-acute ears picking up a frequency Kalen couldn't hear, a low-frequency thrumming deep within the central shaft. She didn't say anything. She went back to her corner. On the 3rd morning, Vex woke before dawn to the smell of warm oil and wood smoke. The siphon was dark except for the glow of the small heating stove. Kalen's cot was empty. She looked down and saw her boots. They weren't where she had left them. They were by the stove. The left one, which had a cracked pressure seal, had been stitched shut with heavy, industrial-grade thread. The right one, with a peeling sole, had been glued and clamped with precision. Beside them sat a blanket thicker than the one she had been using, and a bowl of warm porridge with a single dried apricot on top. Vex picked up the left boot. The stitching was uneven. The work of a man with shaking hands. But the thread was strong. It was reinforced. She walked to the doorway. Kalen was outside, his breath frosting in the cold morning air as he shoveled silt out of the water channel. You didn't have to do this, she said. Kalen didn't look up. They needed fixing. Can't work a siphon in broken boots. I meant the blanket, she said. And the food. Everyone eats, Vex. My last 3 owners didn't fix my boots, she said, her voice uncharacteristically soft. They told me to work until the boots fell off. Then they docked my pay for the replacement. Maybe that is why you broke their jaws. I only broke 1 jaw. Right. The other 2 just had their drones unsettled. He kept shoveling, his movements rhythmic but strained. You are welcome, by the way. I didn't say thank you. I noticed. Vex went back inside and put the boots on. They fit the same, but they felt different, like something that had been given up on and then reconsidered. She ate the porridge. The apricot was sweet enough to make her chest ache. On the 4th morning, she found her corner had been changed. The bedroll was no longer on the cold floor. It had been raised onto a platform, two sturdy wooden planks and four support blocks, lifting her 6 inches off the stone. Vex walked to the center of the room. Kalen was standing over the millstone, his hand resting on the vibrating granite. "Kalen," she said. He looked up. It was the first time she had used his name with any weight behind it. "The boots," she said. "The platform. The food." "Why?" Kalen wiped grease on his pants. "Why what?" "I have been here 4 days. I haven't worked. I haven't spoken. I have done nothing except sit in a corner and eat your rations. Any other owner would have hit me by now. They would have used the neural override." Kalen leaned against the stone. The morning light caught the deep lines in his face, the weariness that seemed etched into his very bones. "My wife stood in that doorway 2 years ago," he said quietly. "She told me I would never be enough. Not enough credits, not enough ambition, not enough of a man because of these hands." He looked at his right hand, which was trembling so hard it rattled against the stone. She was probably right. "That is not an answer," Vex said. "I can fix boots," Kalen said, his voice steady even if his hands weren't. "I can light a stove. I can build a platform out of scrap wood. That is all I know how to do, Vex. Small things. If that is not enough, then it is not enough. But I am not going to hit you for being as broken as I am." Vex looked at the boots on her feet, the shaking stitches, the steady care. "The millstone," she said. "The crack runs from the northwest axis to the southeast. The left side sits lower than the right by 6 millimeters. Kalen stared at her. "How do you know that?" "I have been sitting in this siphon for 4 days doing nothing except listening to it turn. I can hear the friction coefficient. I can hear where the stone is fighting the shaft." "You can hear a 6 millimeter difference?" "My ears are the one thing the union never managed to make defective," Vex said, walking toward him. "The grinding gear is also catching on the third rotation. There is a burr on the drive shaft. Metal rubbing on metal. That is the sound the mule hates. That is why the oxygen isn't pure." Kalen was speechless. "I have been trying to find that catch for 2 months." "I know," Vex said. "I have been listening to you fail at it for 4 days. You could have said something on day 1. "I could have," Vex agreed. "But I wanted to see if you would hit me before I got around to it." The words landed like a stone in a still pond. "What?" Kalen asked. "I wanted to see if you would hit me," she repeated. That is what the sitting was. The silence, the 4 days of nothing. It was a test. Kalen's expression changed. It wasn't anger. It was something closer to grief. "I am not going to hit you, Vex. I know that now." "How?" "Because you fixed my boots instead," she said, placing her hand flat against the vibrating granite. The stone hummed under her palm, the vibrations traveling up her arm and into her core. She closed her eyes, listening to the machine with her fingertips as much as her ears. "I can't fix it alone," she whispered. "The stone is too heavy for one person." "Are you offering to help?" Kalen asked. "I am offering to listen while you lift," Vex said. "What is the difference?" "Lifting is muscle," Vex said, opening her eyes. "Listening is skill. You need both to make this lung breathe again." Kalen looked at her, this Valkyrie who had negotiated her own sale, who quotes laws, and who could hear the soul of a machine. "Show me," he said. The internal cavity of the siphon was a cathedral of dying industry. Massive rib-like struts of oxidized iron curved upward into the darkness, disappearing where the violet moonlight failed to penetrate. Between these ribs, the mechanical heart of the lung beat with a stuttering, uneven rhythm. For 3 days, the silence of the valley had been replaced by the sound of rhythmic labor. It was a symphony of heavy metal being dragged over stone, the hiss of pressurized steam, and the low, constant murmur of 2 people learning to speak a language that didn't involve commands. Kalen stood on a precarious scaffolding of recycled alloy. His upper body vanished into the primary drive housing. His right hand was strapped to a stabilizing brace he'd fashioned from a hydraulic dampener, an attempt to stifle the cortex static that threatened to send his wrench clattering into the depths of the filtration pit. Sweat, thick with the purple dust of Xylo's 4, carved muddy tracks through the grease on his forehead. 6 millimeters to the left. "Voss," Vex said from the floor. She wasn't looking up. She was sitting cross-legged near the water intake, her eyes closed, her head tilted at that unsettling, predatory angle. You are fighting the friction. If you force the bolt now, you will strip the housing. Kalen grunted, his voice muffled by the machinery. My scanners say it is flush. Your scanners are relics, Vex replied, her voice flat and certain. The ultrasonic resonance is peaking at 42 kilohertz. That is the sound of metal screaming before it snaps. Back it off. 1/4 turn. Kalen hesitated, then exhaled a breath that smelled of stale protein and recycled air. He adjusted the wrench. He felt the tension ease. The high-pitched whine that had been vibrating through his teeth subsided into a low, melodic hum. Better? He asked, sliding out of the housing and wiping his hands on a rag that was more oil than cloth. The harmonic is stabilized, Vex said, opening her eyes. Her amber pupils dilated as they adjusted to the dim light of the siphon. It is breathing. It is not healthy, but it is no longer suffocating. Kalen climbed down the ladder, his movements stiff. He reached for a canteen, his hand twitching despite the brace. He took a long swallow of water that tasted of copper and ozone. He looked at Vex. She was wearing the boots he had repaired. She had laced them tight, the industrial thread he'd used standing out like scars against the gray synth leather. Why did you really do it? Kalen asked. Vex didn't blink. Do what? Negotiate the price. You could have stayed with Quill. He would have eventually sold you to a core district supervisor. Better air, better food, no purple dust in your lungs. You chose a failing siphon and a man whose hands can't hold a spoon steady. Vex stood up, her movements fluid and efficient, a stark contrast to Kalen's jagged edges. Quill was going to sell me to a deconstruction yard in the morning, she said. I heard him talking to his assistant while I was on the platform. They were going to strip my synthetic marrow for the rare earth minerals and recycle the rest of me into organic compost. I am small, Kalen. In the eyes of the Union, a small Valkyrie is a waste of high-calorie rations. Kalen felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He knew the Union was heartless, but the casual math of recycling a living, thinking being still made his blood simmer. I didn't know, he muttered. You wouldn't. It is not in the brochures. Vex walked over to the central millstone, her fingers tracing the hairline fracture that spiraled through the granite. You fixed my boots because you saw a tool that was broken. Most people just throw the tool away. You are the first person I have met who thinks the repair is worth the effort. It is not just about the tool, Vex, isn't it? She asked, looking at him. You are repairing this siphon. You are repairing your mule. You are even trying to repair your own nerves with that brace. You are obsessed with the idea that things can be made whole again. Kalen looked away, his gaze landing on the nailed-shut shutters of the house outside. Some things stay broken, he said. You just learn to work around the cracks. Vex moved closer. The smell of her was strange, like warm copper and the faint herbal scent of the nutrient paste the assets were fed. Tell me about the jaw, Kalen said, his voice dropping an octave. You said he deserved it. I want to know why. Vex was quiet for a long time. The only sound was the steady, rhythmic slosh of the water wheel outside and the hiss of the filtration plates. His name was Grendel, she said finally. He was a shift lead at a deep-crust mine near the equator. He bought me to calibrate the seismic sensors because my hearing can pick up a rockfall 3 minutes before the computers do. For the first 2 weeks, I was an asset. I was efficient. I was quiet. She paused, her fingers tightening into a fist. In the 3rd week, he decided that an asset didn't need a locked door. He decided that because I was smaller than the other Valkyries, I was somehow more accessible. He came into my quarters at midnight. He told me that my autonomy subroutines were suggestions, not laws. He told me that if I resisted, he would initiate a factory reset and turn my brain into a blank slate. Kalen's hand gripped the edge of the work table so hard the wood creaked. The cortex static flared, a violent spasm that sent a wave of heat up his arm. What did you do? He asked, his voice a jagged rasp. I didn't say a word, Vex said, her expression as cold as the void between stars. I waited until he was close enough to smell the tobacco on his breath. I waited until he reached for my neck port. Then I put my weight into a single upward strike. I felt his mandible shatter. I felt the teeth snap like dry twigs. He didn't even have time to scream before he hit the deck. She looked at Kalen, her amber eyes searching his. I didn't do it because I was angry, Kalen. I did it because I was choosing to exist. He wanted to erase me. I decided to leave a mark instead. Kalen exhaled a long, shaky breath. Quill said you were defective. Dangerous. I am dangerous, Vex said, to people who think I am a piece of furniture. Are you one of those people, Kalen Voss? Kalen unstrapped the brace from his arm, letting his trembling hand rest openly on the table. If I were, I wouldn't have given you the key to the door, Vex. I'm just a man trying to keep the air moving. I don't have the energy to play God. Vex nodded, a short, sharp movement of her head. Then we should focus on the filtration. The second stage is clogged with carbon dust. If we don't clear it by 2100 hours, the purity will drop below 30%. They worked through the evening, a pair of ghosts moving through the machine. Kalen provided the leverage, the heavy lifting that his augmented frame was built for, while Vex provided the precision. She guided his shaking hands with her voice, a constant stream of acoustic data that acted as a secondary nervous system for him. Stop. 3 millimeters right. Hold. Now apply pressure. Gentle. By the time the violet sun dipped below the horizon, the siphon was purring. It was a deep, resonant sound that vibrated in the marrow of their bones. The output gauge, an old analog needle that had been stuck at 40% for months, began to climb. 45, 50, 60. At 70%, the oxygen began to glow with a faint blue luminescence in the collection tanks. It was pure. It was valuable. It was the breath of life in a world of poison. Kalen slumped against the collection tank, his face covered in soot, but his eyes were brighter than they had been in years. We did it, he whispered. We improved the efficiency by 35%, Vex corrected, though there was a hint of pride in her voice. It is a start. Kalen looked at the blue glow. Tomorrow we go to Onyx Reach. We sell this batch to Nell. We pay off the grain debt to Grisk. Maybe we buy enough sealant to fix that leak in the roof. And Vargo? Vex asked. He will be watching. Let him watch, Kalen said, his voice hardening. He spent 2 years waiting for me to suffocate. I think it's time he saw that I've learned how to breathe again. Vex sat on her raised platform, the extra inch of wood Kalen had added, providing a clear view of the entire siphon. She watched him as he moved to the stove to start a fire. She watched the way he favored his right side, the way his shoulders stayed tense even in rest. Kalen, she said. Yeah, the boots fit well. Thank you. Kalen paused, a piece of kindling in his hand. He didn't look back, but his reflection in the collection tank showed a small, tired smile. You're welcome, Vex. Get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be a long walk. As the fire crackled to life, the siphon felt less like a tomb and more like a fortress. Outside, the winds of Xylo's force screamed against the iron walls, but inside, the blue light of the oxygen collection pulsed like a heartbeat, steady and defiant in the dark. The journey to Onyx Reach was a slow crawl through a world of violet shadows and jagged glass. The cargo mule, loaded with 3 canisters of high-purity oxygen, wheezed as its rusted joints fought the fine silt of the canyon floor. Kalen walked at its head, his hand buried in his jacket pocket to hide the flare-up of his cortex static. The cold air of the moon was thin, the kind of cold that bypassed the skin and went straight for the joints. Vex walked behind the mule, her gray jumpsuit cinched tight with a utility belt she'd scavenged from the siphon's toolshed. She moved with a silent, feline grace, her head constantly turning as she cataloged the acoustic environment of the wastes. To Kalen, the desert was silent except for the wind. To Vex, it was a roar of geological shifts, the hum of distant mining rigs, and the frantic clicking of silicon-based insects under the rocks. You are thinking about her, Vex said, her voice cutting through the wind. Kalen didn't turn. How do you know what I'm thinking? Your heart rate has increased by 12 beats per minute since we passed the 3-kilometer marker. Your stride has shortened. You are anticipating a confrontation. Therefore, you are thinking about the woman who left. Kalen sighed, a plume of white vapor trailing behind him. Her name is Alicia, and I'm not thinking about her. I'm thinking about the 3 canisters of blue gas on the mule. If we don't sell them for full price, we don't eat next week. Elijah is the reason you stayed in the siphon, Vex stated. It was a statement of fact, not a question. You kept the house nailed shut because you are waiting for her to return so you can open it together. That is an inefficient use of resources, Kalen. It's not a resource, Vex. It's a home. Or it was. A home is a structural enclosure that provides safety and environmental control, Vex said. The siphon provides those things. The house provides only ghosts. You should dismantle it for the timber. We need to reinforce the water channel before the winter storms hit. Kalen finally stopped and turned to look at her. Her face was impassive, her amber eyes reflecting the violet sky. You don't have a very romantic view of the world, do you? Romance is a chemical surge designed to facilitate pair bonding in high-stress environments, Vex replied. It often leads to poor decision-making and a lack of tactical awareness. My model was designed for tactical awareness. Kalen shook his head and started walking again. Well, my model was designed for geological engineering and loving a woman who wanted more than I could give her. Turns out both models are prone to system failure. They reached the gates of Onyx Reach as the moon's atmospheric heaters were kicking in, sending ripples of warmth through the central plaza. The market was a chaotic sprawl of corrugated metal stalls and neon signs. Scavengers argued over the price of recycled copper, and miners in battered environmental suits sat in open-air bars, drinking synthetic ale that smelled like jet fuel. Kalen led the mule toward the back of the plaza, away from the main thoroughfare. Nell's Provisions was a narrow shop wedged between a hydropump repair station and a black market medical clinic. The windows were reinforced with mesh, and the sign was a faded hologram that flickered between open and go away. Inside, the shop was a labyrinth of shelves packed with everything from vacuum-sealed rations to pre-war circuitry. The air smelled of vinegar and old paper. Behind the counter stood Nell, her gray hair pulled back into a severe bun, her eyes sharp as a hawk's. Voss, she said, her voice a gravelly rasp. You're late. Grisk was in here an hour ago asking for his credits. He's starting to talk about interest. I have the credits, Nell, Kalen said, lifting a canister from the mule and placing it on the counter with a heavy thud. And I have 3 canisters of 70% purity blue gas. Nell's eyebrows shot up. 70%? The last batch you brought me was barely 40. You find a new well? Or did you finally learn how to read a pressure gauge? We fixed the stone, Kalen said. We? Nell looked past him at Vex, who was standing by the door, her hand resting on the hilt of a heavy wrench. Nell squinted, her gaze moving over Vex's serial number, the Valkyrie from the liquidation lot. I heard someone was crazy enough to buy her. I didn't think it was you, Kalen. You can barely afford your own rations. She is my partner, Kalen said, his voice firm, and she's the reason the gas is blue. Vex stepped forward, her presence filling the small shop. The gas is clean, she said. No sulfur drift, no carbon grit. It is medical grade. You will pay us 150 credits per canister. 150? Nell barked a laugh. I can get union gas for 120. You can get 60% union gas for 120, Vex countered, her voice cool and clinical. You can sell this blue gas to the miners on the North Ridge for 200. They are digging in the high-tox zones. If their filters fail, they die. They will pay for the extra 10%. You are making a 50 credit profit on each unit without leaving your shop. Nell stared at the Valkyrie. She looked at the blue glow in the canister, then back at Vex. You've got a mouth on you, asset. My name is Vex, she said, and I am being accurate. Accuracy is worth a premium. Nell grumbled something under her breath, but she reached under the counter and pulled out a credit slate. 140. That is my final offer. I have to cover the transport fees to the North Ridge. 145, Vex said, and you throw in a jar of those preserved plums in the window. Kalen looked at Vex, his eyes wide. He'd never seen anyone negotiate with Nell and win. Nell groaned, but a reluctant smile touched her lips. Fine. 145 and the plums. Get out of here before you bankrupt me, Vex. As Nell transferred the credits, the door to the shop hissed open. The air in the room suddenly felt colder. Vargo stepped inside, his polished union boots clicking on the metal floor. Behind him stood two enforcers, their hands resting on the stun batons at their belts. "Voss," Vargo said, his voice like silk over glass. "I heard you were in town. I didn't believe it. I thought you'd be too busy choking on that silt you call air." "I'm busy working, Vargo," Kalen said, his hand twitching in his pocket. "Which is more than I can say for you." Vargo's gaze drifted to the canisters on the counter. His eyes narrowed as he saw the blue glow. "Where did you get that?" "We ground it," Vex said, stepping between Kalen and the enforcer. Vargo looked at her, his expression one of pure, unadulterated contempt. "The glitch. I should have known." "Stealing Union tech to boost your output, Voss? That is a serious violation." "It's not Union tech," Kalen said. "It's an old lung siphon, built 50 years before your company even had a charter. Everything on this moon belongs to the Synaptic Union, Voss. You're just a squatter on our land, and squatters have a habit of disappearing when the development teams move in." Vargo leaned over the counter, his face inches from Nell's. "You shouldn't be buying from unlicensed vendors, Nell. It makes the company look bad. It might even make the company decide your lease is no longer profitable." Nell's face went pale, but she didn't blink. "I buy what's good, Vargo, and this gas is better than anything your refinery has put out this month." Vargo's jaw tightened. He turned to Kalen, his smile returning, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Enjoy your little victory, Voss. But remember, the Siphon 7 is on a union-registered fault line. We're conducting a survey next week. If your little scrap heap interferes with our sensors, we'll have to decommission it. For safety reasons, of course." He looked at Vex, his gaze lingering on the serial number on her neck. "And you, Asset, you're a defective unit. I'll be filing a report with the Liquidation Bureau. It's only a matter of time before they come to collect the scrap." Vargo turned on his heel and walked out, his enforcers following him like shadows. The silence he left behind was heavy with the scent of a coming storm. Nell handed Kalen the credit slate and the jar of plums. "You should get out of town, Kalen. Vargo doesn't make empty threats. He's been trying to clear that valley for a year. He wants to build a high-purity refinery right where your siphon sits." "He can try," Kalen said, though his hand was shaking so hard he could barely hold the slate. "He won't try, Voss," Nell said, her voice soft. "He'll just do it. He's got the lawyers and the enforcers. You've got a broken hand and a Valkyrie that isn't supposed to exist." "We have 70% gas," Vex said, her voice cutting through the gloom. "And we have the law. The Union is the law here, Asset." Nell sighed. "Then we will have to become something else," Vex replied. They walked out of the shop and back into the violet light of the plaza. Kalen was quiet, his thoughts a dark tangle of Elysia, the siphon, and the cold reality of Vargo's threat. He looked at the credit slate. They had 435 credits. It was more money than he'd seen in a year. "We should buy the sealant," Vex said, "and a new filter for the water wheel. We need to increase production. If Vargo is coming, we need to be too valuable to move." "Is that what you think?" Kalen asked. "That we can just work our way out of this?" "It is the only logical path," Vex said. "We improve the siphon. We provide a resource the miners can't live without. We make ourselves a necessity." Kalen looked at the jar of plums in his hand. He thought about the house with the nailed shutters. He thought about the 2 years he'd spent waiting for someone to come back and tell him he was enough. "You're right, Vex," he said, his voice regaining its strength. "We don't run, we build." As they walked through the market, Kalen bought the sealant, the filter, and a small solar-powered lamp for Vex's corner. He also bought a bag of real grain, the kind that didn't taste like cardboard. They left Onyx Reach as the moon's heaters were cycling down, the air turning brittle and cold once more. The walk back was faster, the mule was lighter, and their pockets were full. "Vex?" Kalen said as they reached the split boulder that marked the halfway point. "Yes? Why did you ask for the plums?" "I heard your stomach growl when we passed the fruit stand in the trade hub," she said. "I calculated that your glucose levels were dropping. And what? My mother used to say that a partner shouldn't just lift the stone. They should make sure the other person has the strength to keep holding it." Kalen stopped. "You remembered your mother. Valkyries aren't supposed to have families, Vex. They're grown in vats. Vex looked at the violet stars beginning to peek through the dome. We are grown in vats, Kalen, but the women who nurse us in the creches are called mothers. She was a 7 series. She was recycled when I was 5. But I remember her voice. She told me that being small just meant I could hear the things the big ones were too loud to notice. Kalen reached out and rested his shaking hand on her shoulder. He didn't try to hide the tremor. I'm glad you heard me, Vex. I hear everything, Kalen, she said, her amber eyes soft in the twilight. Especially the things you don't say. They reached the siphon as the first snow began to fall, thin purple flakes that melted as soon as they touched the warm metal of the tower. Inside, the blue glow of the oxygen was waiting for them, a silent sentinel in the dark. Kalen spent the night applying the sealant to the roof, his hands steady for the first time in weeks. Vex sat on her platform, the solar lamp casting a warm, yellow light over her books. She was reading the union's property laws, her eyes moving with a terrifying speed. Vargo thinks we are scrap, she muttered to the empty room. He is about to find out that scrap is the most dangerous thing in the galaxy. Because once you've been thrown away, you have nothing left to lose. Kalen looked down from the rafters, the blue light of the siphon reflecting in his eyes. He realized then that he wasn't waiting for Alicia anymore. He was waiting for the morning. And for the first time since the moon had turned violet, he wasn't afraid to breathe. The 5th morning on Xylos 4 arrived with a sky the color of a fresh bruise. The violet sun had not yet crested the jagged horizon of the basalt ridges, but the atmospheric heaters were already humming, sending a low-frequency vibration through the floor of the siphon. Kalen sat at the scarred work table, his right hand clamped between his knees to still the cortex static. It was a bad morning. The tremor felt like a live wire was sparking beneath his skin, sending erratic jolts of heat up to his elbow. Vex was at the water wheel intake, her head submerged in the freezing, subterranean stream. She was listening. To a human, the water was just a chaotic rush of liquid over stone. To her, it was a data stream. She could hear the silt content, the flow rate, and the rhythmic grinding of the pebbles that indicated an obstruction was forming 300 meters upstream. She pulled her head back, her amber eyes bright and dripping. We have 48 hours before the intake pressure drops by 15%, she said, shaking her head like a wet hound. There is a cluster of crystal sediment forming in the primary artery. We need to clear it before the surge. Kalen grunted, his teeth gritted against a sudden spasm in his hand. We'll get to it. First, we have to finish the purge on Tank 2. He stood up, his joints popping like small arms fire. He reached for his wrench, but his fingers refused to close. The heavy tool clattered to the stone floor, the sound echoing through the hollow tower like a gunshot. Kalen stared at his hand, his face twisting in a mask of frustrated rage. Damn it, he hissed. Worthless scrap. Vex walked over and picked up the wrench. She didn't offer it back to him immediately. She looked at his hand, then at the wrench, then back at his face. You are not a machine, Kalen. Machines are designed for a single, unchanging output. When they fail, they are scrap. You are a biological entity with a neurological trauma. Your value is not tied to the stability of your grip. Tell that to the Union, Kalen snapped, finally snatching the wrench from her hand. Tell that to Alicia. In this sector, if you can't turn the bolt, you're just another mouth-eating rations that someone else earned. Vex tilted her head. My primary mother once told me that a cracked cup can still hold water if you know where to grip it. You are trying to grip the cup where it is broken, Kalen. Try a different angle. Kalen didn't have time to respond. The acoustic warning siren on the siphon's outer hull began to wail, a harsh, jagged sound that meant someone had crossed the perimeter wire without authorization. Vex was at the door in a heartbeat, her hand resting on the heavy iron bolt. 3 repulsor transports, she said, her voice dropping into the flat cadence of a tactical asset. 1 command shuttle, 2 security skiffs, Mark IV Union markings. They are moving at 20 kilometers per hour. High profile. Vargo, Kalen muttered, wiping his greasy face with the back of his sleeve. He didn't wait a week. He grabbed the heavy industrial key from the ledge and moved toward the door. Vex didn't step aside. She stood her ground, her gaze fixed on the violet dust cloud rising in the distance. Stay inside, Kalen told her. If they see a Valkyrie quoting laws, they'll shoot first and file the paperwork later. I am a registered asset of this siphon, Vex replied, her amber eyes flashing. According to the Colonial Labor Code, I have the right to represent the interests of the property in the event of an inspection. I am not hiding in the dark while you let them walk over you, Kalen. Kalen looked at her, small, fierce, and utterly certain. He realized then that he couldn't protect her by hiding her. She wasn't a secret to be kept. She was the only reason the siphon was still standing. Fine, he said, pulling the door open. But let me do the talking unless they start citing codes. The transports came to a halt 50 meters from the siphon, kicking up a wall of purple grit. The security skiffs deployed 4 enforcers in matte black tactical gear, their stun batons humming with a low, predatory blue light. These weren't the local settlement guards. These were Union pukes from the sector hub, men who smelled of clean air and arrogance. Vargo stepped out of the command shuttle, looking immaculate in a high-collared gray tunic. He was accompanied by a thin man carrying a holographic scanner, an inspector. "Voss," Vargo called out, his voice amplified by a localized comms field. "I trust you've had a productive morning. I'd hate to think we were interrupting anything important." Kalen stepped into the yard, Vex a shadow at his shoulder. "You're on private property, Vargo. Unless you have an emergency warrant from the governor, you're trespassing." Vargo smiled, a thin, oily expression that made Kalen's skin crawl. "This isn't a raid, Kalen. It's a safety audit. Under the Lunar Development Act, Section 12, the Union has the authority to inspect any structure within 5 kilometers of an active mining vein to ensure structural integrity and environmental compliance." He gestured to the man with the scanner. "This is Inspector Jace. He's here to make sure your little lung isn't about to blow its seals and poison the local aquifer." "It's been here for 50 years without a leak," Kalen said, his voice hard. "You're looking for an excuse to condemn the site. I'm looking for safety, Kalen." "Nothing more," Vargo replied, his eyes drifting to Vex. "And I see you still have that defective asset. I'm surprised she hasn't disassembled you in your sleep yet." The inspector stepped forward, raising his scanner toward the siphon's foundations. The machine emitted a high-pitched chirping sound. Within seconds, a holographic wireframe of the tower appeared in the air between them. It pulsed with angry red light. "Major structural fatigue in the primary support pillars," the inspector droned, his voice devoid of emotion. "Ocular sensors indicate a hairline fracture in the central millstone. Atmospheric output is 72%? He paused, a flicker of genuine surprise crossing his face. 72? That's impossible for a unit of this age. The automated sensors should have tripped the emergency shutoff weeks ago." "The sensors are fine," Kalen said. "We've recalibrated the plates." "By hand?" Vargo laughed. "With those hands, Voss? I find that hard to believe. You're probably overriding the safety protocols and running the pressure gauges in the red. That makes this a Class A public hazard." Actually, Vex stepped forward, her voice ringing out across the quiet yard like a bell. "According to the Federated Safety Standards, Section 19, an atmospheric siphon is exempt from automated shutoff requirements if a certified technician is on site 24 hours a day." Vargo's smile didn't reach his eyes. "And who is the technician? Voss? He's a geologist, not a life support engineer." "I am the technician," Vex said. "I have been calibrated for acoustic structural resonance. I can detect a pressure variance of 0.5% within the secondary filtration loop. My presence satisfies the continuous monitoring clause of the safety code." Vargo leaned in, his face inches from Vex's. "You're a bio-asset, Glitch. You're not a technician. You're a piece of equipment. And since you're a defective piece of equipment with a history of violent outbursts, your monitoring doesn't count for scrap." The enforcers stepped closer, their stun batons crackling. The air felt heavy, charged with the threat of immediate violence. Kalen felt his hand twitch, the tremor so violent it was nearly a spasm. He reached out and placed his shaking hand on the stone wall of the siphon, trying to ground himself. "The law doesn't define technician by biological origin," Vex continued, her voice unfazed by the encroaching enforcers. "It defines it by competency certification. I was certified at the Karth Alpha facility for Level 3 maintenance. Unless you have a formal decertification order from the Bureau of Assets, my monitoring is legally binding. Inspector Jace looked at his scanner, then at Vargo. He sounded hesitant. She's technically correct, Director. If she's on site and her firmware hasn't been officially revoked, the siphon is in compliance. Vargo's face turned a dark mottled red. He looked at the siphon, then at Kalen, then at the girl. He realized he couldn't win this with a simple audit. He needed something bigger. He needed a hammer. He pulled a small silver device from his pocket and tapped a sequence into it. He didn't look at Kalen. He looked at the sky. I thought you might be difficult, Kalen, Vargo said, his voice dropping to a whisper. So I brought someone who knows how to deal with your particular brand of stubbornness. A new sound began to grow in the distance. The deep, rhythmic thrum of a high-altitude shuttle. It wasn't a Union transport. It was a sleek, white and gold executive craft, the kind used by the sector directors of the Synaptic Union. It descended from the violet clouds like a predatory bird, its landing jets scorching the earth as it touched down beside Vargo's command shuttle. The air in the yard went still. Even the enforcers seemed to hold their breath. The shuttle's door hissed open and a ramp extended to the ground. A woman stepped out. She was dressed in a tailored suit of charcoal silk, her hair a perfect, dark honey coil pinned behind her ears. She moved with a grace that felt entirely out of place in the purple dust of the outlands. She looked like a creature of glass and light, someone who had never known the scent of ozone or the grit of the mines. Alicia, Kalen whispered, his hand finally going dead still against the stone. She walked toward them, her gaze skipping over Vargo and the enforcers, landing directly on Kalen. She didn't look at him with anger or hatred. She looked at him with pity. Hello, Kalen, she said. You look tired. I'm working, Alicia, Kalen said, his voice cracking. Why are you here? Vargo contacted the sector office, she said, her voice smooth and melodic. He reported a public hazard, but when I saw the coordinates, I decided to handle the mediation myself. I didn't want the enforcers to do something irreversible to your property. My property? Kalen barked a laugh. You mean the property you're trying to seize for your new refinery? Alicia sighed, a soft, weary sound. We're not seizing it, Kalen. We're offering a transition package. The Union needs this valley for the New Horizon project. You know how important that is for the colony's future. I know how important it is for your career, Kalen said. Alicia stepped closer, her perfume, something floral and expensive, clashing with the metallic tang of the siphon. I've brought the papers, Kalen. A full buyout. Enough credits to get you off-world, back to the core districts, and more importantly, she reached out as if to touch his shaking hand, but she stopped herself. We've secured a slot for you at the New Berlin Medical Center. They have a new neuroregeneration therapy for cortex static. They can fix you, Kalen. You could have your life back. You could be whole again. Kalen froze. The offer was a siren song, a promise of everything he'd lost. No more tremors, no more purple dust, a life in the light where the air didn't taste like poison. And the siphon? Kalen asked. The Union will take over the operation, she said. It will be dismantled to make room for the new facility. And Vex? Alicia finally looked at the Valkyrie standing behind Kalen. Her eyes were cold, professional. The asset will be returned to the Union for assessment. Given her history, she will likely be decommissioned and recycled for parts. It's the standard protocol for glitch units, Kalen. You know that. Kalen looked at Vex. She was standing perfectly still, her amber eyes fixed on him. She didn't look afraid. She didn't look angry. She looked like she was waiting for him to make a calculation. The theme of his life was laid bare in the dust. Was he a man defined by his brokenness, desperate to be fixed at any cost? Or was he the man who had repaired a pair of boots and built a wooden platform because some things are worth the effort of the repair? I need a moment, Kalen said, his voice barely a whisper. Of course, Alicia said, stepping back toward her shuttle. Take all the time you need, Kalen. But remember, this is the only bridge back to the world you loved. Don't let a piece of scrap hold you back. Vargo smiled, a triumphant glint in his eyes. He knew he'd won. He gestured for the enforcers to stand down, and the Union pukes retreated to their transports, leaving Kalen and Vex alone in the shadow of the siphon. The silence that followed was heavier than the basalt ridges. Kalen turned to Vex. She didn't say a word. She just watched him, her acoustic sensors humming in the quiet air. The cost of his old life was standing right in front of him. And for the first time in 2 years, Kalen Voss didn't know if he was willing to pay it. The interior of the siphon felt smaller than usual. The massive ribs of iron seemed to lean inward, the weight of the air pressing down on Kalen's chest as he paced the stone floor. The violet light of the sunset filtered through the high vents, casting long, jagged shadows across the machinery. Vex sat on her platform, her hands resting on her knees. She hadn't moved since they'd come inside. She looked like a statue of oxidized copper, a relic of a war that had never ended. "You should take it," Vex said. Kalen stopped. "What?" "The offer, the credits, the medical regeneration. You have been oscillating at a high-stress frequency for 64 minutes. Your biological systems are nearing exhaustion. The logical choice is to accept the union's terms. You heard what she said, Vex. They'll recycle you. You'll be compost and scrap metal by the end of the month." "I am an asset," Vex replied, her voice flat. "I was created for utility. My utility in this siphon is nearing its end because the union has decided the land is more valuable than the air we produce. Recycling is the natural conclusion for a tool that is no longer needed." "Don't talk like that," Kalen snapped, his tremor flaring so violently he had to grip the cooling pipe to keep from falling. "You're not a tool. You're Vex." "I am Vex Alpha 9, she corrected. "Vex is a nickname you gave me to make your own existence more comfortable. It doesn't change my serial number. It doesn't change my status in the union's ledger." Kalen looked at her, his eyes stinging with a mixture of dust and tears. "You negotiated the price of the blue gas. You quoted the safety standards. You told me that I wasn't a machine. Was all of that just subroutines?" Vex was quiet. For the first time, her head didn't tilt. She looked at him directly, her amber eyes depthless. "It was a choice," she said. "I chose to act as your partner because it increased our chances of survival. But the variables have changed. Survival now depends on your acceptance of Alicia's offer. My existence is no longer a necessary variable." Kalen turned away, slamming his fist against the cooling pipe. The vibration rattled through his arm, a dull, aching pain that matched the knot in his stomach. He thought about New Berlin. He thought about waking up and being able to hold a cup of coffee without spilling it. He thought about Alicia, the way she used to look at him before the accident, before he'd become a liability. But then he looked at the siphon. He saw the patches on the roof. He saw the filter they'd installed together. He saw the jar of plums on the table, still half full. He thought about the house outside, the one with the nailed shutters. He realized that Alicia wasn't offering him his life back. She was offering him a clean, sterile version of the past. A past where he didn't have to be broken, but also a past where he didn't have to care about anything that was. A knock at the door startled him. It wasn't the heavy, rhythmic thrum of an enforcer. It was a light, measured tap. Kalen opened the door. Alicia was standing there alone. She'd removed her executive jacket, and her silk blouse shimmered in the twilight. She looked vulnerable, almost like the woman he'd married 10 years ago on the core world of Terra Prime. "Can I come in?" she asked. Kalen stepped back, allowing her to enter. She looked around the siphon, her nose wrinkling at the smell of grease and wet stone. "It's worse than I thought, Kalen," she whispered, her eyes landing on the cot in the corner. "How can you live like this? You were one of the best geological engineers in the sector. You had a house in the Highlands. You had us. I have a siphon, Alicia. It's honest work. It's scrap work, Kalen. You're a dust biter. You're breathing poison and living in a tomb." She walked over to the work table and saw the organized receipts and the neat columns of numbers Vex had written. She touched the paper with a manicured fingernail. "Did you do this?" "The asset did it," Kalen said. Alicia looked at Vex, who remained motionless on her platform. "It's impressive firmware," she said, her voice dropping into a clinical tone. "But it's dangerous. A Valkyrie that can handle logistics is a system threat. That's why the Union is so adamant about recycling the 9 series. They're too smart for their own good. She turned back to Kalen, her eyes softening. Come with me, Kalen. Vargo is already preparing the demolition orders. If you don't sign by midnight, he'll move in with the heavy lifters and take it by force. I won't be able to protect you then. Protect me? Kalen asked. Is that what you're doing? Or are you just trying to clean up a messy part of your history? Alicia flinched as if he'd slapped her. That's not fair. I loved you, Kalen, but I couldn't watch you fall apart. I couldn't watch you become this. Kalen stepped into the light of the solar lamp. You mean broken? You mean a man who needs a brace to turn a wrench? I mean a man who has given up, she said. Kalen looked at Vex, then back at Alicia. I haven't given up. I've just stopped trying to be what you wanted. I've started trying to be what I am. And what are you, Kalen? A miller for a moon that doesn't care if you live or die? I'm a man who fixed her boots, Kalen said, pointing to Vex. And I'm a man who helped her make the air blue. That's more than I ever did in the Highlands. Alicia's face hardened. She realized the golden bridge wasn't working. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a credit slate, the transfer order. Sign it, Kalen, for your own sake. If you stay here, you'll die in the dust. Vargo will make sure of it. He's already sabotaging your supply lines. Nell won't buy from you anymore. Grisk will call in your debts. You'll be starving within 2 weeks. Kalen took the slate. He looked at the glowing screen. All he had to do was press his thumb to the sensor. The credits would be his. The medical cure would be his. The siphon would be gone. Vex would be gone. He looked at Vex. For the first time she moved. She stood up and walked toward him, her movements silent on the stone floor. She stopped a few feet away, her amber eyes locked on his. The logic is sound, Kalen, she whispered. Take the cure. Kalen looked at the slate, then at Alicia, then at Vex. He thought about the humanistic theme of his life, the idea that value was something you built, not something you were born with. He thought about the way Vex had listened to the machine when he couldn't see the fault. He realized then that being whole didn't mean having a hand that didn't shake. It meant having a soul that wasn't for sale. Kalen Voss took the credit slate and handed it back to Alicia. I'm not signing, he said, his voice as steady as the granite millstone. Alicia stared at him, her mouth falling open in shock. Kalen, don't be a fool. You're throwing away your only chance. No, Kalen said. I'm keeping my partner. Alicia looked at Vex, her eyes filling with a mixture of confusion and disgust. You're choosing a glitch unit over me? Over your health? Over your home? She's not a glitch unit, Alicia. Her name is Vex, and she's the only one who didn't walk away when things got cracked. Alicia backed toward the door, her face a mask of cold fury. You've lost your mind, Kalen. The lung rot has finally gotten to your brain. She turned and marched out of the siphon, her heels clicking angrily on the stone. The door hissed shut behind her, the iron bolt sliding into place with a final heavy thud. The silence that followed was different than before. It wasn't the silence of a tomb. It was the silence of a battlefield after the first charge. Kalen slumped against the door, his hands shaking so violently he had to grip his wrist to keep it from hitting the wall. He felt like he just jumped into the void without a suit. He was broke. He was a target. He was probably going to die. But when he looked up, Vex was standing right in front of him. That was an inefficient decision, Kalen, she said, but her voice was different. It wasn't flat anymore. It was thick with something that sounded dangerously like emotion. I know, Kalen said, a small, hysterical laugh escaping his lips. You threw away 100,000 credits in a medical cure for an asset that is valued at less than 5,000 marks? I told you, Vex, you're not an asset. Vex reached out. Her hand was steady, cool, and smooth. She placed it over Kalen's trembling hand, pressing it against the cold iron of the door. She didn't try to stop the tremor. She just held it. She accepted it. My acoustic sensors are detecting a resonance in your chest cavity, she whispered. It is the same frequency as the blue gas when it is at its purest. Is that a good thing? Kalen asked, looking into her amber eyes. It is the sound of something that is working exactly as it was intended to, she said. Vex pulled her hand away and walked to the work table. She picked up the ledger and the legal pad. We have 4 hours before Vargo realizes we are not signing, she said, her voice regaining its tactical edge. We need to reinforce the perimeter wire. We need to prep the pressure valves for a combat load, and we need to find a way to broadcast our purity data to the independent miners. If the whole valley knows we have blue gas, Vargo can't move in without starting a riot. Kalen stood up, his shoulders square. What do we do first? First, Vex said, looking at the nailed-shut shutters of the house through the high vent. We dismantle the house. We need the timber for the barricades. And you don't need the ghosts anymore, Kalen. Kalen looked at the house. He thought about Alicia's perfume and the cold chrome of her shuttle. He realized she was right. The house was a tomb. He grabbed his heavy sledgehammer and walked to the door. You're right, Vex. Let's take it down. As the sun set over Xylos 4, the sound of wood shattering under iron filled the valley. Kalen Voss and Vex Alpha 9 worked together in the violet dark, tearing down the past to build a future out of the scrap. They were broken, they were defective, and they were the most dangerous things on the moon, because they had finally decided that they were enough. The violet night of Xylos 4 was never truly silent. Even when the winds died down to a whisper and the atmospheric heaters cycled into their low-power slumber, the moon hummed. It was a deep, infrasonic thrum produced by the tectonic friction of the basalt plates grinding against the core. To Kalen, it was a headache that never quite faded. To Vex, it was a map. She sat in the center of the siphon floor, her back against the cool granite of the millstone. The solar lamp he had bought her was turned low, casting a warm, amber glow that barely touched the shadows of the high rafters. Kalen was on the upper gantry, his silhouette a jagged outline against the dull blue luminescence of the oxygen collection tanks. He was working with a soldering iron, his right hand strapped into a new, heavier brace they had fabricated from the house's structural supports. The house was gone now. They had spent 6 hours tearing it down piece by piece. Kalen had swung the sledgehammer until his muscles turned to jelly, and his tremor became a violent, full-body shudder. They had used the heavy timber and the corrugated alloy siding to reinforce the siphon's outer airlock and to create a series of staggered barriers in the yard. It was a fortifications made of memories, a literal shield built from the ruins of the life Alicia had wanted him to reclaim. Vex? Kalen's voice drifted down from the gantry, rough with exhaustion. I hear them, she replied without opening her eyes. How far? 2 kilometers. 3 repulsor sleds. They have muffled their engines with acoustic dampeners, but they cannot hide the displacement of the air. It sounds like a rhythmic tearing of silk. They are moving slow, Kalen. They are trying to be ghosts. They're union pukes, Kalen muttered, the solder smoke curling around his head. They don't know how to be ghosts. They only know how to be hammers. He climbed down the ladder, his joints protesting every movement. He looked older in the amber light, the violet dust of the moon etched into the deep lines around his eyes. He carried a heavy-duty industrial flare launcher, a tool meant for signaling rescue ships that they had modified to fire high-intensity magnesium canisters. It wasn't a weapon of war, but on a moon filled with volatile gases, it was a deterrent. Vargo won't come himself, Kalen said, leaning against the millstone. He'll send the night shift enforcers, men who don't mind getting their hands dirty as long as the credits are good. Vargo is already here, Vex said, finally opening her eyes. She stood up, her movements fluid and silent. One of the sleds has a higher mass signature. The repulsors are firing at a different frequency to compensate for the weight of an armored command module. He is coming to watch his investment be secured. Kalen checked the charge on the airlock's magnetic seals. The credits Alicia had offered were a ghost in the back of his mind, a shimmering promise of a clean, painless future. But as he looked at Vex, her amber eyes reflecting the blue glow of the oxygen they had made together, the promise felt thin, like a hologram losing power. They think we are scrap, Vex said, walking toward the primary control console. They think that because we are broken, we are unable to calculate the cost of our own existence. They are mistaken. What's the plan, partner? Kalen asked, using the word with a deliberate, heavy emphasis. Vex touched the console, her fingers dancing over the diagnostic screens. The siphon is not just a filter, Kalen. It is a resonator. If we open the secondary pressure valves and bypass the acoustic dampeners in the ventilation shafts, We can turn the entire tower into a low-frequency broadcast station. An LRAD? Kalen frowned. You want to blast them with sound? Not just sound, resonance. If I can match the vibration frequency of their repulsor engines, I can induce a harmonic feedback loop. It won't destroy the sleds, but it will fry their navigation sensors and make the riders physically ill. It is a biological override. Kalen looked at the massive iron ribs of the siphon. He thought about the years he had spent listening to this machine fail, and the 4 days Vex had spent listening to it breathe. He realized that they weren't just defending a building. They were defending the idea that a machine, or a person, could be more than the sum of its functioning parts. Do it, he said. The first repulsor sled crossed the perimeter wire 10 minutes later. It was a sleek, black shape that hovered a meter above the purple dust, its prow mounted with a high-intensity searchlight that cut through the darkness like a blade. The light swept over the yard, illuminating the jagged barricades of wood and metal. Voss! A voice amplified by a loud hailer boomed through the valley. This is a final notice. You are in violation of a Tier 1 safety mandate. Power down the siphon and step into the light with your hands visible. Kalen stood behind the reinforced airlock, his flare launcher resting on a notch in the timber. He didn't answer. He looked at Vex. She was standing at the console, her eyes closed, her hands hovering over the pressure sliders. Now? Kalen whispered. Wait, she said, her voice a low hum. I need them closer. I need them within the acoustic focal point of the valley. The second and third sleds moved into the yard, flanking the first. They moved with a predatory caution, their engines a low, wet growl in the violet dark. Kalen could see the enforcers now, men in matte black armor, their visors reflecting the blue glow of their stun batons. They looked like insects, cold and segmented. Behind them, the larger command shuttle hovered at the edge of the perimeter, its chrome hull shimmering. Vargo was in there, safe behind armored glass, watching the liquidation of Siphon 7. Step out, Voss, the voice boomed again. Don't make us use the heavy breachers. You have 10 seconds. Vex's eyes snapped open. Her amber pupils were fully dilated, gold rings shimmering in the dark. Now, she said. She slammed the sliders forward. The siphon didn't make a loud noise. It wasn't a bang or a scream. It was a thrum, a sound so deep and powerful that it was felt in the chest before it was heard by the ears. It was the sound of 5 decades of iron and stone, suddenly vibrating in perfect, terrifying unison. The air in the valley seemed to thicken. Kalen felt the teeth in his jaw rattle. The violet dust on the ground began to dance, forming complex geometric patterns in the dirt. Chladni figures drawn by the hand of a machine. The effect on the repulsor sleds was instantaneous. The sleek black craft began to wobble, their engines emitting a high-pitched, discordant whine as the harmonic feedback loop tore into their sensor arrays. The searchlights flickered and died. The enforcers clutched at their helmets, their hands flying to their ears as the low-frequency pulse bypassed their armor and vibrated their very internal organs. One sled veered wildly to the left, its pilot unable to maintain orientation. It slammed into one of the wooden barricades, a section of Kalen's old bedroom wall, and flipped over, its repulsors sparking and dying in the dust. The loud hailer emitted a jagged burst of static and then went silent. Vex moved her hands with the precision of a conductor, shifting the frequency as the sleds tried to compensate. She was playing the siphon like an instrument, using the architectural flaws of the tower to focus the sound into a weapon. They are retreating, Vex said, her voice strained. The resonance is overtaxing the primary drive shafts. I can only hold this for another 3 minutes before the millstone shatters. Kalen stepped out from behind the airlock. The flare launcher held steady. He saw the enforcers scrambling away from their downed sled, their movements jerky and uncoordinated. They were broken, disoriented, and terrified of the sound that felt like it was trying to shake their souls out of their bodies. He fired the first flare. The magnesium canister streaked through the violet night, a brilliant, blinding white star that exploded over the command shuttle. The light reflected off the chrome hull, turning the darkness into a harsh, artificial day. Go home, Vargo, Kalen roared, his voice amplified by the acoustic resonance of the tower. There's nothing for you here but scrap and noise. The command shuttle hovered for a long moment, its navigation lights flickering as Vargo's pilots fought the feedback. Through the brilliant white glare of the flare, Kalen imagined he could see Vargo's face, pale, furious, and utterly confounded by the fact that a geologist with a tremor and a defective Valkyrie were winning. The shuttle turned. It didn't move with the grace it had arrived with. It lurched and stuttered, trailing a plume of black smoke as its fried electronics struggled to process the lunar gravity. The two remaining skiffs followed. Their pilots slumped over their consoles, fleeing the invisible wall of sound that was tearing their world apart. Vex pulled the sliders back. The thrum faded, leaving a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. The violet night rushed back in, cold and indifferent. Vex slumped over the console, her breath coming in jagged gasps. Kalen was at her side in an instant, his shaking hand reaching out to steady her. "You okay?" he asked, his voice a whisper. "Structural integrity at 84%, she murmured, her eyes glazed. "My internal processors are overheated. The acoustic load was substantial." "You did it, Vex. You drove them off." Kalen looked out at the yard. The downed sled was a heap of black metal in the dust, surrounded by the shattered wood of his old life. He felt a strange sense of peace. The house was gone, but the siphon was still standing. He was still standing, but the peace was short-lived. A low, rhythmic clicking sound began to echo through the siphon, not from the water wheel or the gears, but from the primary filtration shaft. Vex's head snapped up. "Kalen," she whispered. "What is it?" "The feedback," she said, her eyes widening with horror. "It didn't just affect the sleds. The resonance found the fracture in the millstone. The harmonic didn't stop when I pulled the sliders. It became a standing wave." Kalen looked at the massive granite stone. In the dim blue light, he saw it. The hairline fracture he and Vex had spent days monitoring was no longer a line. It was a gap. And from that gap, a thin whistling sound began to emerge. The sound of high-pressure oxygen escaping into the vacuum of the shaft. The siphon was no longer breathing. It was bleeding. And through the open airlock, Kalen saw a single figure walking across the violet dust toward them. It wasn't an enforcer. It wasn't Vargo. It was a man in a grease-stained jumpsuit, carrying a heavy industrial thermal cutter. He was the foreman Vargo had hired to sabotage the works if the raid failed. He moved with the slow, deliberate pace of someone who knew exactly where to cut to make the whole world collapse. "We're not done," Kalen said, his hand twitching with a sudden, violent energy. "Not yet." The whistle from the millstone grew into a scream. Within the hollow chamber of the siphon, the sound was deafening, a jagged, high-frequency pitch that threatened to shatter the very glass of the gauges. The blue gas, their precious medical-grade oxygen, was venting into the filtration pit, turning into a swirling mist of luminous vapor. If the pressure didn't stabilize, the secondary tanks would overpressurize and turn the tower into a 5-story pipe bomb. Kalen grabbed a heavy wrench from the table, his right hand jerking with a violent, rhythmic spasm. The cortex static was worse than it had ever been, fueled by the adrenaline and the lingering resonance of the acoustic blast. He felt like his arm was being electrocuted from the inside out. "Vex! The pressure relief valve!" Kalen shouted over the scream of the gas. "The bypass is jammed!" Vex cried, her hands flying over the console. "The thermal shock from the resonance has fused the magnetic couplings. Kalen, the millstone is destabilizing. If the rotation doesn't stop, the centrifugal force will throw the granite through the hull." Kalen looked at the airlock. The foreman was only 20 meters away, the orange glow of his thermal cutter igniting in the dark. The man didn't want the oxygen. He wanted the explosion. A siphon blast would be ruled an industrial accident, the tragic result of a defective owner and his glitch asset running a machine beyond its safety ratings. Vargo would get his refinery, and Kalen would be a footnote in a corporate safety report. "Stop the wheel," Kalen commanded. "I'm going to the bypass. You cannot." Vex said, leaping from the platform. "The manual bypass is behind the primary drive shaft. The vibration levels are lethal. Your hand, Kalen. You cannot turn the wheel with the tremor." "I don't need to be steady, Vex," Kalen roared, his eyes wild. I just need to be fast. He didn't wait for her to argue. He sprinted toward the rear of the millstone, the air around him thick with the cold, sweet scent of pure oxygen. He reached the drive shaft, a massive column of iron that was vibrating so hard it looked like a blur in the dim light. Behind it, tucked into a narrow alcove of grease and shadow, was the manual bypass wheel. It was a rusted iron circle that required 200 pounds of torque to budge. Kalen reached for the wheel. His right hand flared with pain, the nerves firing in a chaotic, jagged rhythm. He couldn't even make a fist. The fingers danced and twitched, a useless tangle of flesh and bone. "Damn you!" Kalen screamed at his own arm. "Not now!" He looked at the bypass wheel, then at the millstone. The granite was wobbling now, the gap in the fracture wide enough to see through. The scream of the gas was reaching a crescendo. Then he felt a presence at his shoulder. Vex was there. She didn't try to take the wrench from him. She didn't try to push him aside. She reached out and placed her small, cool hand over his trembling one. Her touch was like a grounding wire. She didn't stop the tremor. She joined it. "I can hear the rhythm of the static, Kalen," she whispered, her voice calm and clear amidst the chaos. "It is not noise. It is a frequency. It is 72 cycles per second." "What?" Kalen gasped, his forehead pressed against the vibrating iron of the shaft. "The tremor," she said. "It matches the oscillation of the drive shaft's third harmonic. If you fight it, you will fail. But if you use the momentum of the spasm, you can generate more torque than a steady hand ever could." "Use it?" Kalen looked at her as if she were insane. "It's a defect, Vex. It's a failure." "It is a vibration," she countered, her amber eyes locking onto his. "And on this moon, vibration is power. Grip the wheel, Kalen. When the spasm peaks, throw your weight to the left. I will provide the pivot." Kalen didn't understand the physics, but he understood the girl. He wrapped his fingers around the iron wheel. His arm bucked and kicked, the cortex static trying to tear his grip loose. Vex stepped behind him, her arms wrapping around his, her body providing the structural stability he lacked. She was the frame. He was the engine. "Now!" Vex shouted. Kalen didn't try to steady his hand. He let the tremor take him. As his arms spasmed with a violent, rhythmic surge, he timed his movement to the peak of the nerve fire. He threw his entire body into a clockwise rotation, the vibration of his arm acting like a pneumatic impact wrench. The rusted wheel groaned. A shower of orange sparks erupted from the gears as the metal fought metal. "Again!" Vex cried. Kalen felt a white-hot flash of pain in his shoulder, but he didn't stop. He leaned into the brokenness. He used the very thing that had made him a liability to generate a burst of mechanical force that no healthy man could have achieved. The wheel turned. 1 inch. 2. With a final, jagged heave, the bypass valve snapped open. The scream of the gas changed instantly from a high-pitched shriek to a deep guttural roar as the pressure was diverted into the emergency vent tubes. The blue mist began to clear. The millstone's wobble slowed as the pneumatic brakes engaged. The siphon didn't explode. It exhaled. Kalen slumped against the drive shaft, his breath coming in ragged sobs. His right arm was numb, hanging at his side like a dead weight. He looked at Vex. She was covered in grease and dust, her gray jumpsuit torn, but she was smiling. A real, genuine smile that lit up the dark corners of the tower. "You used the defect," she whispered, her voice filled with wonder. "You turned the noise into a signal." Kalen looked at his hand. It was still shaking, but the shaking felt different now. It didn't feel like a failure. It felt like a resonance. A shadow fell across the floor. The foreman stood in the doorway of the siphon, his thermal cutter glowing like a small sun. He looked at the gauges, his face twisting in a snarl as he realized the explosion wasn't coming. "You should have taken the credit, scrapper," the man growled, raising the cutter. "Now I have to do this the hard way." Kalen started to reach for his flare launcher, but it was across the room near the collection tanks. Vex was already moving, but she was too far away. The foreman stepped forward, the orange blade of the cutter hissing as it cut through the air toward the primary oxygen tank. If he breached that tank, the resulting flash fire would incinerate everyone inside. The man never made it to the tank. A low, thunderous growl echoed from the yard outside. the sound of 50 heavy-duty industrial engines. A flood of high-intensity searchlights hit the siphon, turning the interior into a blinding white glare. "Vargo!" the foreman shouted, looking toward the door. "I'm doing it! I'm cutting it now! Stay your hand, you idiot!" A new voice boomed through the air. This was not the loud hailer of the enforcers. This was the raw, unamplified roar of 100 angry men. Kalen and Vex moved to the doorway, shielding their eyes against the light. The yard was full, not with Union sleds, but with the battered, rusted, and heavily modified rigs of the independent miners. There were over 50 of them, the men and women from the North Ridge, the ones who had bought Kalen's blue gas from Nell. They were in their pressurized digging suits, carrying rock drills, hydraulic hammers, and seismic charges. In the center of the crowd stood Nell. She was sitting on top of a water hauler, a shotgun resting across her knees. Beside her was the cargo mule, its mechanical head bobbing as if it were nodding in agreement. "Vargo!" Nell called out, her voice carrying over the hum of the rigs. "You still here, you corporate puke? Because the boys from the deep crust just heard you were trying to shut down the only clean air in the valley, and they've decided they have some thoughts on the matter." A sleek Union command shuttle was hovering at the edge of the ridge, but it didn't move forward. It stayed in the shadows, its navigation lights blinking with a sudden, hesitant caution. Vargo was many things, but he wasn't a fool. He knew that 50 angry miners with seismic charges were a force that even the synaptic Union couldn't ignore without starting a moon-wide insurrection. "Vargo!" Nell shouted again. "We've seen the purity data, 70% blue gas. If you touch this siphon, you're not just taking Voss's land, you're taking our lungs. And we've decided we're not for sale." The searchlights from the miners' rigs focused on the command shuttle. The chrome hull reflected the light, making it look like a target. The shuttle stayed silent for a long minute. Then without a word, it rose into the violet sky, its repulsors glowing bright as it retreated toward the sector hub. The remaining skiffs followed, scurrying away like beetles caught in a flashlight. The foreman in the doorway dropped his thermal cutter. He looked at Kalen, then at Vex, then at the wall of angry miners in the yard. He didn't say a word. He just turned and ran into the darkness. Kalen stepped out into the yard, his legs shaking, his heart hammering against his ribs. The miners didn't cheer. They were men of the stone. They didn't do much cheering. They just nodded. They revved their engines. They looked at the siphon, the tower of iron and wood that had survived the night. Nell climbed down from the hauler and walked over to Kalen. She looked at his grease-stained face, then at his trembling hand, then at Vex standing at his shoulder. "You look like scrap, Kalen," she said, her voice rough but kind. "I feel like scrap, Nell." She looked at the siphon. "My boy told me what you did, how the girl played the tower like a drum. I didn't believe it until I felt the ground shaking 5 miles away." She reached out and patted the iron hull of the siphon. "It's a good lung, Kalen, cracked, rusted, and stubborn as hell. Just like the man who runs it." She handed him a heavy crate of supplies, filters, sealant, and enough high-calorie rations to last a month. "Consider this a down payment on the next batch of blue gas. The North Ridge is going to need a lot of it." The miners began to disperse, their rigs rumbling away into the violet night. They had work to do. They had lives to lead. They had air to breathe. Kalen and Vex stood in the yard as the silence returned. The moon hummed its low-frequency song. The violet sun began to peek over the horizon, casting the first light of dawn across the basalt ridges. Kalen looked at the ruins of the house. He saw the planks they had used to save the siphon. He saw the platform he had built for Vex's corner. He realized that the house hadn't been a home. It had been a cage. A home wasn't something you nailed shut to keep the ghosts in. It was something you built out of the pieces of what you had left. "Vex?" Kalen said, his voice steady. "Yes, Kalen?" "The platform. You said you wanted it raised another inch?" 1.5, she corrected, her amber eyes bright in the morning light. "And the books. I believe we need to update our contractual definitions. Asset is an archaic term. I believe equity partner is more accurate according to the latest colonial statutes." Kalen laughed, a real deep sound that didn't have a single tremor in it. "Equity partner it is," he said. They walked back into the siphon together. The door closed and the key turned in the lock. This time not to keep the world out, but to keep the future in. The millstone began to turn, a slow, rhythmic grind that sounded like a heartbeat. The lung was breathing. And for the first time in his life, Kalen Voss was breathing right along with it. The morning after the siege of Siphon 7 did not arrive with a fanfare. It came with the sound of settling dust and the cooling of stressed iron. The violet sun of Xylos 4 crept over the horizon, its light bleeding through the high vents of the tower in long, bruised streaks of lavender and gold. Outside, the yard was a graveyard of corporate ambition. The wreckage of the repulsor sled sat like a dead beetle in the dirt, its black hull scorched by the magnesium flares Kalen had rained down upon it. Kalen sat on the edge of the central millstone, his boots caked in purple silt. His right arm was tucked into his lap, the cortex static having subsided into a dull, low-frequency hum that felt more like a tired purr than an electric storm. He was staring at the doorway, where the morning light illuminated the thousands of dust motes dancing in the air. For the first time in 2 years, he didn't feel like he was waiting for the other shoe to drop. He felt like the shoe had dropped, shattered, and he was simply looking at the pieces. Vex was at the primary intake, her sleeves rolled up to her elbows. She was scrubbing the grease from a set of magnetic couplings she had salvaged from the downed Union sled. She worked with a quiet, terrifying efficiency, her amber eyes scanning the components for any sign of microscopic stress fractures. "That was quite a show, Kalen," she said, her voice echoing slightly in the hollow tower. "My acoustic sensors are still recalibrating from the sheer volume of those miners' rigs." 112 decibels of raw, unrefined defiance. Kalen let out a short, jagged laugh. "It wasn't me, Vex. It was Nell, and the boys from the North Ridge. I didn't think I had that many friends left on this moon." Vex stopped scrubbing and looked at him. "They did not come because they are your friends, Kalen. They came because you are the one who provides the blue gas. In a closed system environment like this moon, survival is a shared calculation. By choosing to stay, by choosing to repair the siphon instead of taking the Union's credits, you became a critical variable in their survival logic. They were not protecting a man. They were protecting their own ability to breathe." Kalen leaned back against the granite, the cold stone seeping through his flight jacket. "Is that all it is to you? A calculation?" Vex was silent for a moment. She picked up a salvaged copper wire and began to coil it around her finger. "To the Union, yes. To the miners, perhaps. But to an asset that has been returned 3 times because she was deemed uncontrollable, it is something else." "What?" "A precedent," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You proved that a defective unit and a broken engineer can generate more value than a corporate refinery. You shifted the market reality of the entire valley. That is not a calculation, Kalen. That is a revolution." The sound of a heavy engine approaching the yard cut through the morning stillness. Kalen instinctively reached for his flare launcher, but Vex raised a hand. "It is a single signature. High mass, low speed. It is Nell's water hauler." Kalen stood up, his joints popping like dry twigs. He walked to the airlock and stepped out into the biting morning air. Nell was already climbing down from the hauler's cab, her gray bun slightly more disheveled than usual, a heavy data pad tucked under her arm. She looked at the wreckage of the sled and spat a glob of brown tobacco juice into the dust. "Scrap metal," she grunted, nodding toward the wreck. "Vargo's going to be crying into his synthetic gin for a month over the insurance premiums on that thing." "He'll be back, Nell," Kalen said, his voice weary. "He doesn't take no from a dust biter." Nell walked up to him and slapped the data pad against his chest. "Maybe, but he's going to have to go through the Colonial Board of Trade first." Kalen took the pad, his brow furrowing as he looked at the screen. "What is this?" Vex walked out of the siphon, her amber eyes instantly scanning the data on the pad. "It is a petition for communal utility status," she said, a hint of surprise in her voice. Nell nodded, a grim smile touching her lips. "The Northridge miners spent the night signing it. 52 independent claims, Kalen. They've declared Siphon 7 an essential infrastructure node for the local mining district. Under the old charter, the one the Union keeps trying to bury, an essential node cannot be seized or demolished unless the company can provide an immediate, higher purity alternative for the same price. They can't, Kalen said, his heart beginning to pound. Their refinery won't be online for 2 years. Exactly, Nell said. And until then, the law says you're untouchable. You're not just a squatter anymore, Kalen. You're the district's primary life support contractor. She looked at Vex. And the girl. I've included a writer. Since she's the one who achieved the 70% purity rating, she's listed as the chief technical officer. According to the board, she's no longer an asset. She's a vested humanoid professional. The union can't recycle her without a full hearing in the core districts. And Vargo hates hearings. Too much paperwork. Vex stared at the pad. Vested humanoid professional, she whispered. That is 42 syllables of legal shielding. It is highly efficient. Kalen looked at Nell, then at Vex, then at the siphon. He felt a lump forming in his throat, a mixture of relief and a strange, terrifying sense of responsibility. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was a node. He was a partner. Why are you doing this, Nell? Kalen asked. You're sticking your neck out for a man who can't even hold a wrench steady. Nell stepped close, her eyes narrowing until they were like flint. Because I'm tired of watching the union turn everything I love into a line on a ledger, Kalen. I'm tired of seeing good people get tossed into the scrap heap because they've got a bit of rust on them. You and that girl, you're the first thing I've seen in a decade that actually works the way it's supposed to. She turned and climbed back into her hauler. Now get to work. The boys on the ridge are expecting another 10 canisters by Friday. And Kalen? Yeah? Fix your damn roof. The purple snow's coming in, and I don't want my CTO catching a cold. She roared away, the hauler kicking up a cloud of violet dust that hung in the air like a veil. Kalen and Vex stood in the yard, the silence returning, but it was a different kind of silence. It was the silence of a house being built, not a tomb being sealed. Kalen looked at his right hand. The tremor was there, a low vibration, but it didn't feel like an enemy. It felt like a hum, a part of the resonance of the moon, a part of the machine he had spent his life serving. Let's go inside, Vex, Kalen said, his voice steady. We have a millstone to forge. They spent the rest of the day stripping the downed Union sled. It was a gold mine of high-grade alloy, magnetic dampeners, and heavy-duty hydraulic struts. Kalen used the sledgehammer to break the casing, and Vex used her acoustic sensors to guide the thermal cutter, ensuring they didn't damage the delicate internal circuitry. They weren't just scavenging, they were transforming. They took the polished chrome arrogance of the Union and broke it down into the raw materials they needed for their survival. They used the sled's structural frame to create a massive circular brace for the granite millstone, a ring of black alloy that would hold the fracture together, no matter how fast it spun. By sunset, the siphon was a different place. The smell of scorched metal and warm grease was thick in the air, but beneath it was the crisp, clean scent of the blue gas. The new brace was in place, the black metal gleaming against the gray granite like a crown. Kalen wiped his forehead with a greasy rag. He looked at the machine. It was a patchwork of ancient stone, rusted iron, and stolen chrome. It was ugly, it was mismatched. It was defective by every corporate standard in the galaxy. It is beautiful, Vex said, her hand resting on the new alloy ring. Is it? Kalen asked, looking at her. Yes, she replied, because it is a synthesis. It is the past being held together by the present. It is the noise being used to create a signal. Kalen looked at the violet stars beginning to peek through the high vents. He thought about Alicia and the clean, sterile halls of the New Berlin Medical Center. He realized that if he had taken the cure, he would have been whole, but he would have been empty. He would have been a perfect machine in a world that didn't need him. Here, in the dust and the noise, he was broken, but he was also essential. We're not just contractors, Vex, Kalen said, his voice reflecting the deep resonance of the siphon. We're the ones who keep the lights on when the Union pukes have gone home to their core worlds. We're the scrap heapers. I like that term, Vex said, her amber eyes glowing in the twilight. It has a high degree of acoustic impact. They sat together on the raised platform, eating the real grain Nell had brought them. The cortex static in Kalen's arm hummed in time with the water wheel outside. It was a bad morning, perhaps, but it was a perfect evening. And as the blue gas began to pulse in the tanks once more, Kalen Voss realized that he didn't need to be fixed. He just needed to be used. 2 weeks had passed since the Union's safety audit had been repelled by the combined stubbornness of a geologist and 52 miners. The Valley of Siphon 7 was no longer a graveyard. It had become a hive of activity. Every morning, the rumble of independent haulers echoed through the basalt ridges as the miners arrived to trade ore, spare parts, and news for canisters of 72% blue gas. Kalen Voss stood at the heart of the siphon, his boots braced against the stone floor. He was no longer hiding his right hand in his pocket. It was exposed, the cortex static, a constant, visible vibration that traveled from his fingertips to his shoulder. But he wasn't looking at it with resentment. He was looking at the new pressure calibrator he was assembling, a complex lattice of copper and silicon that required a precision he hadn't possessed in years. He didn't use a mechanical stabilizer. He didn't use a brace. He simply waited for the rhythm of the tremor. When the spasm peaked, he moved the soldering iron with a jagged, lightning-fast motion, letting the momentum of the tremor carry the solder into the joint. It was a motion that would have been impossible for a steady hand. He was using the noise to weld the signal. Vex stood at the primary control console, her head tilted as she monitored the acoustic output of the water wheel. She was wearing a new jumpsuit Nell had scavenged for her, a heavy-duty engineering suit with CTO hand-painted in white letters on the shoulder. She looked less like a biological asset and more like the beating heart of the moon. "The third harmonic is stabilizing, Kalen," she said, her voice resonant and clear. "The new alloy brace is absorbing 98% of the centrifugal vibration. The millstone is rotating at 300 revolutions per minute. We are currently at 74% purity." Kalen set the soldering iron down and wiped a bead of sweat from his nose. 74? That's almost medical-grade prime. Vargo's going to have a stroke. "Vargo has already filed 6 formal complaints with the Board of Trade," Vex said, a hint of amusement in her amber eyes. "He is claiming that our use of salvaged Union tech constitutes industrial espionage." "What did the board say?" "They told him that according to the salvage code, any equipment abandoned on a private site during an unauthorized safety audit becomes the property of the site owner." She paused, her smile widening. "They also informed him that our purity rating is now the benchmark for the entire sector. If the Union refinery wants to compete, they have to match our 74%. Kalen laughed, a deep, full sound that shook the very air in the siphon. "I'd love to see the look on his face when he has to tell his sector director that a couple of dust biters are outperforming a billion-credit refinery." They worked through the afternoon, a seamless partnership of muscle and frequency. Kalen handled the heavy iron and the hot solder, while Vex handled the logic and the sound. They didn't need to speak much. They moved in a shared rhythm that had been forged in the fire of the siege. As the violet sun began to set, Kalen walked to the large bay door they had installed to replace the narrow airlock. He looked out over the valley. The miners' rigs were gone for the night, leaving the yard quiet and peaceful. The ruins of the house were gone, replaced by a neat stack of timber in a small solar-powered greenhouse where they were trying to grow real vegetables in the filtered moon soil. Kalen walked to the edge of the yard, stopping at the split boulder where he had first found Vex after she'd run away. He sat down, letting his legs dangle over the edge of the ridge. The wind was cold, but it felt good against his skin, a reminder that he was alive, that he was part of the moon's harsh, beautiful environment. Vex walked out and joined him, sitting on a rock nearby. She didn't say anything. She just watched the sky with him. "You're quiet, Kalen," she said after a few minutes. "I was just thinking," he replied, looking at his shaking hand, "about what Alicia said, about being whole." "Do you still want it?" she asked. "The cure?" Kalen looked at the siphon, its blue glow illuminating the dark valley like a lighthouse. He looked at the alloy brace they had made from the Union sled. He looked at Vex's CTO patch. "I spent 40 years of my life thinking that a straight line was the only way to measure a life," Kalen said, his voice low and thoughtful. "I thought that if I wasn't perfect, if I couldn't hold a wrench steady, I was broken beyond repair. I thought my value was tied to my utility in a world that only cares about things that work without complaining." He paused, a small smile touching his lips. "But these last 2 weeks, they've taught me something else. I'm not fixed, Vex. My hand still shakes. My arm still hurts. I'm still a man who lost his wife and his career to a moon mine accident. He looked at her, his amber eyes reflecting the violet twilight. But I'm more whole now than I ever was in the Highlands. Because for the first time, I'm not trying to hide the cracks. I'm using them. I'm building a life around them. I realize that a cup that's never been broken can't tell you anything about the water it holds. But a cup that's been shattered and glued back together, that cup has a story. It has a resonance. It has a value that can't be measured in credits. Vex reached out and rested her hand on his trembling wrist. To be whole is not to be flawless, Kaylin, she whispered. To be whole is to be integrated. You have integrated your trauma into your purpose. You are no longer a geologist with cortex static. You are the man who makes the air blue. And I am no longer a 9 series asset. I am the one who hears the blue gas. Kaylin nodded. We're a couple of cracked cups, Vex. Yes, she agreed, but we hold the best water in the valley. They sat in silence for a long time, watching the violet stars burn in the velvet dark of the moon. Kaylin felt a deep sense of peace, not the peace of an ending, but the peace of a beginning. He knew that Varga would keep coming. He knew that the Union would keep trying to find a loophole. He knew that his hand would never stop shaking, but he also knew that he wasn't alone. He had a partner. He had a community. He had a purpose that was forged in the very scrap heap he had once feared. Kaylin stood up, his posture straight and confident. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the iron key to the siphon. He handed it to Vex. You keep it tonight, he said. I'm going to go check on the greenhouse. I think the tomatoes are actually starting to turn red. Vex took the key, her fingers brushing his. Red tomatoes on a violet moon, she said. That is a highly improbable biological outcome. I know, Kaylin said, walking toward the tower, but around here we specialize in the improbable. He walked toward the siphon, his stride rhythmic and steady. He didn't look back at the ridge. He didn't look back at the past. He looked at the blue light of the tanks, the heart of his new world pulsing in the dark. He was a scrap heaper, a dust biter, and a broken engineer. And as he breathed in the 74% medical-grade oxygen, he realized that he had never felt more alive. I spent 40 years of my life measuring my worth by the things I could build and the lines I could draw. I thought that being a man meant being a machine, unwavering, precise, and impervious to the rust of time. When the cortex static took my hands, I felt like a bridge that had lost its central pylon. I looked in the mirror and saw only the collapse. I sat in this siphon for 2 years, nailing the shutters shut because I was afraid that if the world saw the cracks, they would finally realize I was scrap. But Vex, she didn't see the cracks as failures. She saw them as frequencies. She showed me that a tremor isn't just a loss of control, it is a rhythm that can be harnessed. She showed me that an asset isn't just a serial number, it is a consciousness choosing to exist against the cold calculus of the Union. I realized that the things we throw away, the broken tools, the defective people, the failed dreams, they aren't waste. They are the raw materials of the future. We are all just scrap metal in the end, floating in the void. But if we find the right resonance, if we find someone who can hear the music in our noise, we can forge something that even the most perfect machine could never achieve. I am Kaylin Voss, and I am a cracked cup. And for the first time in my life, I am proud of the scars. I spent so much time trying to be fixed that I almost missed the chance to be useful. I wonder, in your own life, is there a part of yourself you've been trying to hide or repair because you think it makes you less? What would happen if you stopped fighting that defect and started listening to the resonance it creates? Kaylin Voss turned the heavy iron bolt of the siphon door, the metallic click echoing through the violet valley like a promise kept. He looked at his shaking hand one last time, gave it a small, respectful nod, and stepped into the blue glow of his home. The siphon exhaled a long, luminous plume of oxygen into the night sky, a single blue star burning bright against the darkness of the moon.